Colonel Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the naval base pier, watching the sunrise paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and crimson. Her Army combat uniform bore the silver eagle of a full colonel, earned through 15 years of blood, sweat, and proving herself in a man's world. Today would mark another milestone in her career, but she had no idea it would also become one of the most humiliating moments of her life. The joint military conference was scheduled to begin at 0800 hours, bringing together high-ranking officers from all branches of the armed forces. Sarah had been selected to represent the Army's Special Operations Command, a recognition of her expertise in counterterrorism and her successful missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her posture straight and purposeful as she made her way toward the conference center. The morning air was crisp, filled with the salt tang of the ocean and the distant sounds of naval operations. Sailors moved about their duties with practiced efficiency, their white uniforms standing out against the gray steel of the ships moored nearby. Sarah had always felt a kinship with the Navy, despite their good-natured inter-service rivalry. They shared the same commitment to protecting their country, the same willingness to sacrifice everything for the mission. As she approached the main building, Sarah noticed several other officers gathering near the entrance. She recognized a few faces from previous joint operations and nodded politely as she passed. Her mind was focused on the presentation she would give later that morning, outlining new strategies for special operations coordination between branches. Inside the conference center, the atmosphere buzzed with professional energy. Officers from all 5 branches mingled in the lobby, their various uniforms creating a tapestry of military tradition and pride. Sarah made her way to the registration table, where a young Navy ensign checked her credentials and handed her a folder containing the day's agenda. "Good morning, Colonel Martinez," the ensign said with a respectful smile. "Your presentation is scheduled for 1,000 hours in Conference Room Alpha." "Thank you," Sarah replied, tucking the folder under her arm. She had arrived early, as was her habit, preferring to familiarize herself with the venue and perhaps grab a cup of coffee before the proceedings began. The lobby gradually filled with more officers as the start time approached. Sarah found herself standing near a group of Navy personnel, including several captains and a rear admiral she didn't recognize. Their conversation was animated but professional, discussing recent naval exercises in the South China Sea. It was then that she first saw him. Admiral Marcus Thornfield entered the lobby like a force of nature. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, with broad shoulders and a commanding presence that seemed to fill the entire space, he was impossible to ignore. His navy dress blue uniform was immaculate, adorned with ribbons that spoke of a distinguished career spanning 3 decades. The golden trident of the Navy SEALs gleamed on his chest, along with decorations for valor, service, and leadership. Thornfield's steel-gray eyes swept the room with the practiced gaze of a man accustomed to command. His jaw was set in a perpetual expression of stern authority, and his salt and pepper hair was cut in a regulation style that emphasized the sharp angles of his face. When he moved, others instinctively stepped aside, creating a path through the crowd. Sarah had heard of Admiral Thornfield, though they had never met. His reputation preceded him like a thunderclap. Known throughout the Navy as Iron Marcus, he was legendary for his leadership during the most dangerous SEAL missions of the past 2 decades. He had led teams into the heart of enemy territory, extracted hostages from impossible situations, and earned the respect of warriors around the world. But his reputation also included another aspect that made many officers uncomfortable. Thornfield was known for his old-school attitudes toward women in combat roles. Despite the military's official policies of integration and equality, he had never made any secret of his belief that certain positions should remain exclusively male domains. As Thornfield made his way through the lobby, accepting greetings and handshakes from his fellow officers, Sarah felt a strange mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She respected his military achievements, but she had also heard the stories about his treatment of female officers who dared to challenge his traditional views. The moment that would change everything began innocuously enough. Sarah was reviewing her notes when she felt a presence beside her. She looked up to find Admiral Thornfield standing there, his imposing figure casting a shadow over her small table. I don't believe we've been introduced, he said, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of a man who had shouted orders over gunfire and helicopter rotors. Admiral Marcus Thornfield, Naval Special Warfare Command. Sarah stood immediately, extending her hand in a professional greeting. Colonel Sarah Martinez, Army Special Operations Command. It's an honor to meet you, Admiral. Thornfield's handshake was firm, almost crushing, and he held her gaze with those penetrating gray eyes. For a moment, she thought the introduction would proceed normally, with the mutual respect that typically characterized interactions between senior officers. She was wrong. Thornfield's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, his eyes moving to her collar insignia and then back to her face. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth, but it was not a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile a predator might wear when sizing up prey. "Colonel, is it?" he said, releasing her hand and taking a half-step back. "Army Special Operations. That's interesting." There was something in his tone that immediately put Sarah on alert. 20 years of military service had taught her to recognize subtle signs of disrespect, and she sensed that Admiral Thornfield was about to demonstrate exactly why his reputation for controversy was well-earned. "Yes, sir," she replied carefully, maintaining her professional demeanor. "I'm here to present on Joint Special Operations Coordination Protocols." Thornfield's smile widened, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Around them, other officers continued their conversations, unaware that a confrontation was brewing. "Joint Operations," Thornfield repeated, as if the words left a bad taste in his mouth. "Tell me, Colonel, how many real combat missions have you actually led?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had led dozens of missions, including several classified operations that had saved countless lives. Her record spoke for itself, filled with commendations and successful mission completions. But something in Thornfield's tone suggested that her answer wouldn't matter. "I've led 43 combat missions over the past 8 years, Admiral," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the insult implicit in his question, "including 12 deep reconnaissance operations and 6 hostage rescue missions." Thornfield chuckled, a sound that managed to be both dismissive and condescending. "Hostage rescue. That's cute. Let me guess, you were part of a larger team providing support?" Sarah felt her jaw tighten. She had been the team leader on every one of those missions, making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. She had earned her rank through blood and sacrifice, proving herself in the most demanding environments the military could offer. "I was the mission commander on all 6 operations, Admiral," she said, her voice taking on a slight edge despite her efforts to remain professional. "Mission commander," Thornfield repeated, his tone now openly mocking. "You know, Colonel, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've led SEAL teams into places that would give your Army boys nightmares. Real missions where failure means death, and success means bringing everyone home alive." The conversation was beginning to attract attention from nearby officers, though they tried to appear as if they weren't listening. Sarah could feel eyes upon them, and she knew that whatever happened next would be remembered and discussed throughout the military community. "I understand you have extensive experience, Admiral," Sarah said carefully. "I certainly don't want to minimize your service or achievements." "How generous of you," Thornfield replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But here's what I don't understand. The Army sends a colonel to a conference on special operations. Not a brigadier general, not even someone with real command experience. They send a colonel who thinks leading a few small-scale missions qualifies her to discuss strategy with real warriors." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the full impact of Thornfield's insult sank in. He wasn't just questioning her experience or qualifications. He was publicly humiliating her, dismissing her rank and achievements in front of her peers. "Admiral," she began, but Thornfield cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Let me explain something to you, Colonel," he said, emphasizing her rank as if it were a joke. "When I was earning my trident, leading real men on real missions where real blood gets spilled, the Army was still figuring out whether women could handle carrying a rifle. Now, they want to play dress-up and pretend that a few successful training exercises qualify someone for a seat at the adults' table." Sarah felt her hands begin to tremble with suppressed rage. Every instinct screamed at her to defend herself, to list her qualifications and achievements, to remind this arrogant admiral that she had earned her position through merit and sacrifice. But she also knew that any emotional response would only reinforce his perception of her as weak and unqualified. "I believe my record speaks for itself, Admiral," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Does it?" Thornfield asked, his voice rising just enough to ensure that everyone within 20 feet could hear clearly. "Because from where I stand, all I see is someone who's been handed opportunities that real soldiers had to fight for. The Army's diversity initiative in action, I suppose." The accusation hit Sarah like a sledgehammer. In one sentence, Thornfield had dismissed 15 years of her career, reducing her achievements to nothing more than political correctness and quotas. He had stripped away her dignity and professionalism, painting her as an undeserving beneficiary of special treatment. Around them, the lobby had grown noticeably quieter. Other officers were now openly staring, some with expressions of shock, others with barely concealed embarrassment. A few Navy officers looked uncomfortable, clearly wanting to distance themselves from their admiral's behavior, but unwilling to intervene. Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had been through too much, sacrificed too much to break down now. Instead, she drew upon every reserve of strength and dignity she possessed. "I earned my rank through service and sacrifice, Admiral," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Just like every other officer in this room." Thornfield's expression showed no hint of remorse or recognition. If anything, he seemed pleased by her distress, as if he had accomplished exactly what he set out to do. "I'm sure you believe that, Colonel," he said with false sympathy. "But believing something and it being true are two different things. When the real fighting starts, when lives are on the line, we need leaders who earn their positions in battle, not in boardrooms." The insult was so profound, so deliberately cruel, that several nearby officers actually gasped audibly. Sarah felt the world spinning around her, her carefully constructed professional facade cracking under the assault of Thornfield's words. She wanted to scream, to tell him about the nights she had spent in enemy territory, about the soldiers whose lives she had saved, about the sacrifices she had made for her country. She wanted to remind him that courage and leadership had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with character. But before she could respond, before she could find the words to defend herself against this character assassination, something unexpected happened. The lobby doors opened with a sharp bang, and 3 figures strode into the room with purposeful steps. Sarah didn't recognize them immediately, but the effect on Admiral Thornfield was instantaneous and dramatic. His arrogant smirk vanished, as if it had been physically wiped from his face. His posture stiffened, and for the first time since Sarah had met him, she saw something that looked suspiciously like fear flicker across his features. The 3 men approaching wore Army uniforms adorned with the stars of general officers. But these weren't just any generals. As they drew closer, Sarah's heart began to pound as she recognized exactly who they were. The first was General Robert Hayes, a man whose reputation for brilliance and integrity was legendary throughout the military. The second was General Michael Torres, known for his innovations in special operations tactics. The third, walking slightly ahead of the others with the confident stride of supreme authority, was General James Washington. General Washington was not just any 3-star general. He was the commanding officer of United States Special Operations Command, effectively making him the highest-ranking special operations officer in the entire American military. His word carried weight that reached from the Pentagon to the White House, and his approval or disapproval could make or break careers. As the 3 generals approached, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. Other officers moved aside, creating a clear path through the room. Admiral Thornfield's face had gone pale, and Sarah could see a thin sheen of perspiration forming on his forehead. What happened next would be burned into the memory of every person present, a moment that would be recounted in military circles for years to come. General Washington's eyes locked onto Sarah's face, and his stern expression softened into something approaching warmth. Without hesitation, without acknowledging Admiral Thornfield's presence, he walked directly to where Sarah stood and came to attention. Then, in a gesture that sent shockwaves through the assembled officers, General Washington rendered a perfect military salute to Colonel Sarah Martinez. "Colonel Martinez," he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the lobby, "it's an honor to see you again." The silence in the lobby was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of ships' horns from the harbor. Sarah stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what was happening. General Washington's salute was still held in perfect form, waiting for her response, while Admiral Thornfield looked as though he had seen a ghost. With trembling hands, Sarah returned the salute, her voice barely audible as she replied, "General Washington, sir." "Thank you, sir." As their salutes dropped, General Hayes stepped forward and also came to attention, rendering his own salute to Sarah. "Colonel Martinez, your reputation precedes you." General Torres, "And I've been looking forward to this meeting." General Torres followed suit, his salute crisp and respectful. "Colonel, it's a privilege to finally meet the officer we've heard so much about." The three generals saluting a colonel was unprecedented. In normal circumstances, junior officers saluted senior officers, not the other way around. But these weren't normal circumstances, and these salutes carried a message that everyone present understood immediately and completely. Admiral Thornfield stood frozen in shock, his face cycling through shades of red and white as the implications crashed over him like a rogue wave. The woman he had just publicly humiliated and dismissed as unqualified was clearly someone of extraordinary importance to the highest levels of Special Operations Command. Sarah struggled to find her voice, overwhelmed by this unexpected turn of events. "Generals, I'm honored by your presence, but I don't understand." General Washington placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his expression kind but his voice carrying the steel of absolute authority. "Colonel Martinez, we received word that you would be presenting at this conference. The three of us made a special trip from Washington specifically to hear what you had to say about joint operations coordination." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the assembled officers before continuing. "You see, gentlemen, Colonel Martinez isn't just any officer. She's the architect of Operation Silent Thunder, the mission that rescued 37 American hostages from terrorist compounds in Syria without a single casualty." A ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. Operation Silent Thunder had been classified at the highest levels, known only to those with the most sensitive security clearances. The successful rescue had been attributed to Special Operations Forces in general, but the identity of the mission commander had remained secret. General Torres picked up the narrative, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Colonel Martinez didn't just plan that operation from a comfortable office in the Pentagon. She led the assault team personally, making real-time tactical decisions under enemy fire while coordinating assets from 4 different military branches. Admiral Thornfield's face had gone completely pale. His hands hung limp at his sides, and Sarah could see the recognition dawning in his eyes. He was beginning to understand exactly how catastrophic his earlier words had been. General Hayes stepped forward, addressing the crowd directly. "What you gentlemen may not know is that Colonel Martinez holds a Distinguished Service Cross, the Navy Cross, and the Air Force Cross. She is the only officer in modern military history to have received the highest valor decorations from 3 different branches of service." The revelation sent another wave of shock through the assembled officers. These decorations were awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat, for actions that went far beyond the call of duty. To have received one was the mark of exceptional courage. To have received 3 was almost unimaginable. Sarah felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of vindication rather than humiliation. She had never spoken publicly about her decorations, considering them simply the recognition of doing her job to the best of her ability. She had certainly never used them to establish her credentials or demand respect. General Washington's voice grew stronger, carrying a note of pride that was unmistakable. "Colonel Martinez has led more successful special operations missions than most full colonels see in their entire careers. Her tactical innovations have been adopted by special forces units across NATO, and her leadership under fire has saved literally hundreds of lives." He turned to face Admiral Thornfield directly, his expression hardening into something that could have cut steel. "Which is why I find it particularly disturbing to learn that there are still officers in our military who believe that a person's qualifications should be judged by anything other than their performance and character." The words hit Thornfield like physical blows. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound emerged. The man who had been so eloquent in his mockery and dismissal now found himself speechless in the face of his own ignorance and prejudice. General Torres addressed the crowd again, his voice carrying a note of disappointment. Gentlemen, we're here today to discuss the future of joint operations and military cooperation. These discussions require the participation of our best and brightest officers, regardless of their branch of service or any other factor. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Colonel Martinez represents the very best of what our military can produce. Her expertise in multi-branch coordination isn't theoretical. It's been tested and proven in the most dangerous and challenging environments our forces face. Sarah found her voice at last, though it was shaky with emotion. Generals, I appreciate your words more than I can express. But I need to clarify something. She turned to face the assembled officers, drawing upon every reserve of dignity and professionalism she possessed. I didn't request this intervention. I came here today prepared to let my work speak for itself, to contribute to our military's mission regardless of personal attacks or preconceptions. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. Every officer in this room has earned their position through service and sacrifice. We all took the same oath, made the same commitment to defend our nation and our values. Those values include treating our fellow service members with respect and judging them by their actions, not by prejudices or assumptions. Admiral Thornfield finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. Colonel Martinez, I need to apologize. I spoke without knowledge, without understanding. My words were inexcusable. Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine shock and what might have been the beginning of remorse. But she also recognized that this was likely the first time in his career that Admiral Thornfield had been forced to confront the consequences of his prejudices so directly and publicly. Admiral, she replied carefully, apologies are meaningful only when they're accompanied by changed behavior. I hope this experience will help you reconsider how you evaluate and interact with your fellow officers in the future. General Washington stepped between them, his presence commanding immediate attention. This incident highlights exactly why we're here today. Our military strength comes from our ability to work together, to combine the unique capabilities and perspectives of all our service members. He gestured towards Sarah. Colonel Martinez's success in joint operations isn't accidental. It comes from her understanding that every branch, every specialty, every individual brings something valuable to the mission. She doesn't dismiss the Navy SEALs or Marine Force Recon or Air Force Pararescue. She finds ways to leverage their strengths while compensating for their limitations. Admiral Thornfield's humiliation was complete and public. Every officer in the lobby had witnessed his prejudiced attack on Sarah and the subsequent revelation of her extraordinary qualifications. His reputation for arrogance and narrow-mindedness had been exposed for all to see. But General Hayes wasn't finished. Admiral Thornfield, I think it would be valuable for you to understand exactly what kind of officer you attempted to dismiss today. He turned to address the crowd again. Operation Silent Thunder wasn't Colonel Martinez's only achievement. She also designed and led Operation Desert Shield, which eliminated a terrorist training camp and rescued 42 captured intelligence operatives. That mission required coordination between Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, and Air Force Special Operations. The list of Sarah's accomplishments continued, each revelation adding weight to the growing understanding of exactly how wrong Thornfield had been. These weren't minor missions or training exercises. They were major operations that had required the highest levels of skill, courage, and leadership. General Torres added his own perspective. What makes Colonel Martinez exceptional isn't just her tactical skills or her personal courage, though both are impressive. It's her ability to see beyond service rivalries and individual egos to focus on mission success. He looked directly at Admiral Thornfield as he continued. She understands that a Navy SEAL's expertise in maritime operations, an Army Ranger's skills in direct action, and an Air Force combat controller's ability to coordinate air support are all pieces of the same puzzle. Her job is to put those pieces together in ways that maximize our chances of success and minimize our casualties. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the praise and support, but also deeply uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation. She had never sought recognition or special treatment, and she certainly hadn't wanted to see a fellow officer humiliated, regardless of his behavior toward her. Generals, she said quietly, while I appreciate your support, I think we should focus on the mission ahead of us. Admiral Thornfield made an error in judgment, but we all have work to do. Her words showed a grace and professionalism that made Thornfield's earlier behavior seem even more shameful by comparison. Here was an officer who had been publicly attacked and humiliated, yet her first concern was for the military's mission and the dignity of a fellow service member. General Washington nodded approvingly. Colonel Martinez demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership we need more of in our military. The ability to rise above personal grievances and focus on the larger mission. He turned to face the assembled officers. Gentlemen, we came here today to discuss the future of joint operations. That future depends on our ability to work together, to respect each other's contributions, and to judge each other by our performance rather than our preconceptions. The tension in the lobby was palpable. Every officer present understood that they had witnessed something significant, a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Admiral Thornfield's public humiliation served as a stark reminder of the consequences of prejudice and narrow-mindedness. But there was something else in the air as well. A sense that this incident, painful as it was, might actually serve a larger purpose. It had exposed problems that needed to be addressed and had demonstrated the kind of leadership that the military needed to embrace. General Hayes checked his watch and announced, "The conference will begin in 15 minutes. I suggest we all use this time to reflect on what we've learned here today and to prepare ourselves for the important work ahead." As the crowd began to disperse, Admiral Thornfield remained frozen in place, clearly struggling with what had just occurred. The confident, arrogant officer who had entered the lobby that morning had been replaced by someone who looked lost and uncertain. Sarah approached him carefully, her expression serious but not unkind. "Admiral, we all make mistakes. The measure of a leader isn't whether they stumble, but whether they learn from their stumbles and use them to become better." Thornfield looked up at her, his eyes showing a mixture of shame and confusion. "Colonel, I don't know how to begin to make this right. My words were unforgivable. They were hurtful and wrong," Sarah agreed. "But forgiveness is always possible when there's genuine remorse and a commitment to change. The question is whether this experience will make you a better officer and a better person." As the three generals prepared to leave for their own meeting, General Washington approached Sarah one final time. "Colonel, your presentation this morning just became even more important. You have the attention of every officer in this conference. Use it wisely." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders. What had begun as a routine conference presentation had evolved into something much more significant. She had become a symbol, a representative of all the qualified officers who had faced discrimination and dismissal based on prejudice rather than performance. The lobby continued to empty as officers made their way to their respective conference rooms. Admiral Thornfield remained behind, still processing what had occurred. Sarah could see him struggling with the reality of his own behavior and its consequences. As she gathered her materials and prepared for her presentation, Sarah reflected on the morning's events. She felt vindicated, certainly, but also burdened by the knowledge that her experience was far from unique. How many other qualified officers had faced similar treatment? How many had been dismissed or overlooked because of prejudice rather than any failing in their performance? The path ahead was clear, even if it wouldn't be easy. She had been given a platform and an opportunity to make a difference. Her presentation would no longer be just about tactical coordination and operational procedures. It would be about the values and principles that should guide their military and their nation. The confrontation with Admiral Thornfield had been painful, but it had also revealed truths that needed to be acknowledged and addressed. The military's strength came from its diversity, from its ability to harness the talents and perspectives of all its members. Any force that dismissed or marginalized capable officers based on prejudice was weakening itself unnecessarily. As Sarah walked toward Conference Room Alpha, she carried with her not just her presentation materials, but the hopes and aspirations of every service member who had ever been judged by something other than their merit and dedication. The morning's humiliation had transformed into an opportunity for change, and she was determined to make the most of it. Conference Room Alpha fell silent as Colonel Sarah Martinez stepped up to the podium. Word of the morning's confrontation had spread quickly through the military community, and Every seat was filled with officers eager to see how she would handle this unprecedented situation. The presentation that had originally been scheduled as a routine briefing on joint operations coordination had evolved into something far more significant. Admiral Thornfield sat in the third row, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible discomfort and shame. He had arrived early, taking a seat where he couldn't avoid seeing Sarah, but also couldn't escape if the presentation became too difficult to bear. The other officers gave him a wide berth, their body language making it clear that his morning's behavior had not been forgotten or forgiven. General Washington, General Hayes, and General Torres occupied the front row, their presence lending gravity to the proceedings. Behind them sat a collection of colonels, commanders, and senior officers from all branches of the military, many of whom had personally witnessed the lobby confrontation. Sarah stood quietly for a moment, gathering her thoughts and surveying the audience. She had given hundreds of briefings during her career, but none had carried this kind of weight or expectation. Every person in the room was watching her not just as a subject matter expert, but as a symbol of something larger and more important than tactical coordination. She began without preamble, her voice clear and confident despite the morning's emotional turmoil. Ladies and gentlemen, I was originally scheduled to discuss joint operations coordination protocols. However, given this morning's events, I think it's appropriate to start with a more fundamental question. What makes our military strong? The question hung in the air as Sarah activated the projection system. Instead of the tactical diagrams and organizational charts that the audience had expected, the screen displayed a simple photograph. A group of soldiers in desert camouflage, their faces dirty and exhausted, but their eyes bright with the satisfaction of mission success. This photograph was taken after Operation Desert Shield, Sarah continued. You're looking at the men and women who successfully eliminated a terrorist training facility and rescued 42 captured intelligence operatives. The mission required 72 hours of continuous operations in hostile territory, perfect coordination between 4 different military branches, and split-second decision-making under enemy fire. She paused, letting her eyes move across the audience. I want you to look at these faces and tell me which ones belong to Navy SEALs, which ones are Army Rangers, which are Marines, and which are Air Force Special Operations. I want you to identify which soldiers earned their positions through merit and which ones were promoted because of diversity initiatives. The challenge was clear, and Admiral Thornfield shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Looking at the photograph, it was impossible to make such distinctions. The soldiers all wore the same uniform, bore the same expression of professional competence, and shared the same evident pride in their accomplishment. Of course, you can't make those distinctions from this photograph, Sarah said, because when bullets are flying and lives are on the line, the only thing that matters is performance. Not gender, not background, not preconceptions about who belongs on which team. Just results. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed map of the Syrian compound that had been the target of Operation Silent Thunder. Red arrows indicated the movement of different teams, while blue symbols marked extraction points and support positions. Operation Silent Thunder required the coordination of more than 200 military personnel across 4 branches of service, Sarah explained. Navy SEALs provided maritime insertion and extraction capabilities. Army Rangers handled direct assault operations. Marines secured perimeter positions and evacuation routes. Air Force Special Operations provided close air support and medical evacuation. Admiral Thornfield found himself leaning forward despite his discomfort, drawn in by the complexity and precision of the operation Sarah was describing. His professional expertise allowed him to appreciate the difficulty of what had been accomplished, even as he struggled with the knowledge of who had accomplished it. The mission's success depended entirely on our ability to see past service rivalries and individual egos, Sarah continued. Every team leader had to trust that their counterparts from other branches would execute their portions of the mission flawlessly. Any failure of coordination or communication could have resulted in casualties among our own forces or the failure to rescue the hostages. She clicked to the next slide, showing photographs of some of the rescued hostages. Men and women of various ages and backgrounds, all bearing the physical and emotional scars of their captivity, but all alive and safe because of the coordinated efforts of American Special Operations Forces. These are the people we saved, Sarah said simply. Intelligence operatives who have been captured while gathering critical information about terrorist operations. Their information prevented 3 separate terrorist attacks on American soil and led to the disruption of an entire terrorist network. The room was completely silent now, every officer absorbed in the presentation. Even those who had initially come out of curiosity about the morning's confrontation found themselves genuinely impressed by the scope and complexity of the operations being described. General Washington nodded approvingly from the front row. This was exactly what he had hoped Sarah would do, demonstrate through concrete examples why the military needed to embrace the talents and perspectives of all its members. Sarah moved to her next point, displaying a chart that showed the increasing complexity of modern military operations. The nature of warfare has changed dramatically over the past 2 decades, she explained. Our enemies don't limit themselves to single domains or traditional tactics. They combine conventional weapons with cyber warfare, propaganda campaigns with terrorist attacks, political manipulation with military action. She gestured toward the chart. To defeat these complex, multifaceted threats, we need military forces that are equally complex and adaptable. We need teams that can think creatively, adapt quickly, and bring diverse perspectives to problem solving. Admiral Thornfield found himself nodding unconsciously. His own experience in special operations had taught him the value of diverse skill sets and perspectives. He had seen firsthand how teams with different backgrounds and approaches often outperformed more homogeneous units. This brings me to a critical point, Sarah continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. Any military force that dismisses or marginalizes capable officers based on prejudice rather than performance is weakening itself unnecessarily. The words were directed at the entire audience, but everyone present understood that they were particularly relevant to Admiral Thornfield's behavior that morning. I want to share with you some statistics that I think will surprise you, Sarah said, clicking to a new slide. Over the past decade, joint operations commanded by officers from traditionally underrepresented groups have achieved a success rate that is 15% higher than the military average. Murmurs rippled through the audience. This was not the kind of information that was widely discussed, but it was based on classified analysis of mission outcomes across all branches of service. Furthermore, Sarah continued, these operations have achieved this higher success rate while maintaining casualty rates that are 20% lower than average. The numbers suggest that diversity of leadership isn't just politically correct, it's tactically and strategically advantageous. Admiral Thornfield felt a sick sensation in his stomach. The data directly contradicted everything he had assumed about military effectiveness and the role of diversity in combat operations. His prejudices hadn't just been morally wrong, they had been factually incorrect. Sarah seemed to sense the discomfort in the room and moved to address it directly. I'm not suggesting that diversity is more important than competence, she said. I'm suggesting that true competence includes the ability to recognize and utilize the talents of all qualified personnel, regardless of their background or characteristics. She clicked to another slide, this one showing a timeline of military innovations. Throughout history, our military's greatest advances have come from officers who thought differently, who challenged conventional wisdom, who brought new perspectives to old problems. The timeline included examples from various eras: the integration of African American units during World War II, the development of special operations forces during Vietnam, the incorporation of women into combat roles during recent conflicts. Each innovation had initially faced resistance from traditionalists, but had ultimately strengthened the military's capabilities. The common thread in all these advances, Sarah explained, is that they required leaders who were willing to look beyond their preconceptions and judge people by their performance rather than their demographics. General Torres leaned over to whisper something to General Washington, who nodded approvingly. Sarah's presentation was accomplishing exactly what they had hoped, not just defending her own qualifications, but making a broader case for the kind of inclusive, merit-based leadership that the military needed. Now let me address the elephant in the room, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. This morning I was told that my rank and position were the result of diversity initiatives rather than merit. I was told that I had been given opportunities that should have gone to more qualified candidates. The room grew tense as Sarah addressed the confrontation directly. Admiral Thornfield slumped in his chair, wishing he could disappear. I want to respond to those accusations not with anger or defensiveness, But with facts, Sarah continued. She clicked to a new slide showing her military record in stark, objective terms. 15 years of service. 43 combat missions, led as primary commander. 0 mission failures. Casualty rates 30% below military average. 3 highest valor decorations from 3 different branches of service. Innovations in joint operations tactics, now taught at staff colleges worldwide. Each fact hit the audience like a physical blow. The scope of Sarah's achievements was extraordinary by any standard, and the suggestion that they were the result of special treatment rather than exceptional performance was obviously absurd. But here's what troubles me most about this morning's incident, Sarah said, her voice taking on a note of sadness. It wasn't really about me. It was about every qualified officer who has been dismissed or marginalized because of prejudice rather than any failing in their performance. She clicked to another slide showing statistics on military retention rates among different demographic groups. We are losing talented officers at alarming rates, not because they can't handle the demands of military service, but because they're tired of having to constantly prove that they deserve to be here. The statistics were sobering. The military was hemorrhaging experienced personnel from underrepresented groups at rates that threatened its long-term effectiveness. Every time we allow prejudice to override merit, we make our military weaker, Sarah said. Every time we dismiss a qualified officer because of assumptions rather than evidence, we lose capabilities that we may desperately need in future conflicts. Admiral Thornfield felt as though he had been punched in the stomach. The implications of Sarah's presentation were clear and devastating. His attitudes weren't just personally offensive, they were professionally damaging to the military he had sworn to serve. Sarah moved toward her conclusion, her voice carrying both passion and authority. Gentlemen, we face threats that are more complex and dangerous than anything in our military's history. Our enemies are adaptive, innovative, and ruthless. They will exploit any weakness, any blind spot, any failure of coordination or communication. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. We cannot afford to handicap ourselves with prejudice and narrow-mindedness. We cannot afford to dismiss or marginalize any officer whose skills and dedication could contribute to our mission success. The audience was completely absorbed now, understanding that Sarah was articulating principles that went to the very heart of military effectiveness and national security. The future of our military depends on our ability to harness the full range of talents and perspectives available to us, Sarah said. It depends on our willingness to judge officers by their performance rather than our preconceptions. It depends on leaders who understand that strength comes from unity of purpose, not uniformity of background. She clicked to her final slide, which showed the same photograph of soldiers from Operation Desert Shield that had opened her presentation. But now the audience saw it differently, understanding the profound teamwork and coordination that it represented. These soldiers didn't succeed because they all looked the same or thought the same way, Sarah concluded. They succeeded because they were united in their commitment to the mission and to each other. That's the kind of military we need to build, not one that excludes capable people, but one that includes and empowers everyone who has the skills and dedication to serve. As Sarah stepped back from the podium, the room erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. Officers rose to their feet, their applause not just recognition of an excellent presentation, but acknowledgement of a truth that many had known but few had been brave enough to articulate so clearly and powerfully. Admiral Thornfield remained seated, tears streaming down his face as the magnitude of his morning's behavior crashed over him like a tsunami. He had not just attacked an exceptional officer. He had embodied everything that was wrong with outdated attitudes that were weakening the military he loved. The standing ovation seemed to echo through the halls of the naval base long after the last officer had filed out of Conference Room Alpha. Sarah stood at the podium, overwhelmed by the response to her presentation, but also acutely aware that Admiral Thornfield remained in his seat, his head buried in his hands as the room emptied around him. General Washington approached the podium first, his expression serious but pleased. Colonel Martinez, that was exactly what this military needed to hear. Your presentation will be distributed to senior staff throughout all branches of service. General Hayes nodded in agreement. Sarah, you've articulated something that many of us have felt but couldn't express so clearly. The data you presented will be invaluable in changing minds and policies. As the three generals prepared to leave for their next meeting, General Torres paused beside Admiral Thornfield's chair. "Admiral, I think you and Colonel Martinez need to have a private conversation. This morning's events don't have to define either of your careers, but how you handle the next few hours will." After the generals departed, Sarah found herself alone in the conference room with Admiral Thornfield, who still hadn't moved from his position. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. Finally, Thornfield raised his head, his face showing the ravages of complete emotional devastation. "Colonel Martinez, I don't know how to begin to apologize for what I did this morning." Sarah studied his face carefully, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus mere embarrassment at being caught in his prejudices. What she saw was a man who appeared to be grappling with fundamental questions about beliefs he had held for decades. "Admiral," she said carefully, taking a seat across from him rather than maintaining the formal distance that their ranks would normally require. "Tell me what you're thinking right now." Thornfield struggled to find words, his military bearing completely abandoned as he wrestled with emotions he wasn't accustomed to expressing. "I'm thinking that I've been a fool," he said finally. "I'm thinking that I've let my prejudices blind me to the truth for so long that I don't know what else I might be wrong about." Sarah nodded, recognizing the signs of someone whose worldview was being fundamentally challenged. "That's a painful realization, but it's also the beginning of wisdom. I keep thinking about all the officers I might have dismissed over the years," Thornfield continued, his voice breaking slightly. "All the talented people I might have overlooked or undermined because they didn't fit my narrow idea of what a warrior should look like." The admission was clearly costing him enormous emotional effort. Admiral Thornfield had built his entire identity around his military achievements and his status as a respected leader. Confronting the possibility that he had been systematically wrong about such a fundamental issue was shaking him to his core. "Admiral," Sarah said gently, "we all have blind spots. The question isn't whether we've made mistakes, but whether we're willing to learn from them and do better going forward." Thornfield looked up at her, his eyes showing a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "How can you be so generous to me after what I did? I attacked your character, your qualifications, your very right to be here. If someone had done that to me, I would want their head on a platter." Sarah considered her response carefully. This was a teachable moment, not just for Admiral Thornfield, but potentially for the broader military culture that he represented. "Because anger and revenge don't solve problems," she said finally. "They just perpetuate cycles of hurt and division. What happened this morning was painful, but it also created an opportunity for understanding and change." She paused, then continued, "Admiral, you're a decorated war hero with 30 years of service to our country. You've led men and women into harm's way and brought them home safely. You've made sacrifices for this nation that most people can't even imagine. One moment of prejudice doesn't erase all of that." Thornfield shook his head. "You're more generous than I deserve. The things I said this morning, they weren't just wrong, they were cruel. I deliberately tried to humiliate you in front of your peers." "Yes, you did," Sarah agreed. "And that was unacceptable. But what matters now is what you do with this experience. Do you use it to become a better leader, or do you let it destroy you?" The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the conference room door. A young Navy lieutenant entered with obvious nervousness, clearly uncomfortable with interrupting two senior officers. "Excuse me, sir, ma'am," the lieutenant said. "Admiral Thornfield, you have an urgent message from Naval Special Warfare Command." Thornfield accepted the sealed envelope with obvious reluctance, knowing that word of the morning's events had likely reached his superiors. He opened it slowly, his face growing pale as he read the contents. "Bad news?" Sarah asked, though she could guess from his expression. "I'm being recalled to Washington for a formal review of my conduct," Thornfield said quietly. "Effective immediately. Admiral Peterson is flying out to assume temporary command of my operations." Sarah felt a wave of sympathy for the man who had humiliated her just hours earlier. Despite his behavior, she understood that his career and reputation were now in serious jeopardy. "Admiral, may I ask you something personal?" she said. Thornfield nodded, too emotionally drained to maintain his usual formal barriers. "Do you have a daughter?" Sarah asked. The question caught Thornfield off guard. "Yes, actually. Emily. She's 25, a Marine Corps captain serving in logistics." "And are you proud of her service?" "Incredibly proud," Thornfield replied immediately. She's an outstanding officer, brilliant, dedicated, tough as nails. She's earned every promotion, every commendation. Sarah nodded. I imagine there have been times when she's faced the same kind of attitudes you expressed this morning. Officers who assumed she was less qualified, less capable, less deserving of respect because of her gender. The realization hit Thornfield like a physical blow. His daughter, his pride, and joy, the officer he respected above almost all others, had probably experienced exactly the kind of treatment he had just subjected Sarah to. Oh God, he whispered, his face crumbling. Emily, she's probably dealt with people like me her entire career. Probably, Sarah agreed gently. How does that make you feel? Thornfield was crying openly now, his composure completely shattered. It makes me sick. It makes me want to find every officer who ever treated her that way and apologize to them all. Admiral, your daughter is successful despite the prejudices she's faced, not because of any special treatment. Just like every other qualified officer who doesn't fit traditional stereotypes. We succeed because we're good at what we do, not because the system is rigged in our favor. The conversation was interrupted again, this time by the arrival of Admiral Peterson, Thornfield's replacement. Peterson was a tall, stern-looking officer with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, but his expression was sympathetic rather than judgmental. Marcus, Peterson said, using Thornfield's first name in a gesture of personal rather than professional concern. I came as soon as I got word. How are you holding up? Thornfield struggled to compose himself. Jim, I made a terrible mistake. I let my prejudices get the better of me and attacked an outstanding officer for no reason other than my own narrow-mindedness. Admiral Peterson looked at Sarah with obvious respect. Colonel Martinez, I've read your file. Your reputation precedes you, and it's an honor to meet you. Thank you, Admiral, Sarah replied. I was just having a conversation with Admiral Thornfield about learning from difficult experiences. Peterson nodded approvingly. Marcus, you're going to face some difficult questions in Washington. The Navy takes allegations of discriminatory behavior very seriously, especially from someone in your position. I understand, Thornfield said, and I deserve whatever consequences come my way. But, Admiral Peterson, I want to make something clear. Colonel Martinez didn't file a complaint or request any action against me. She's shown more grace and professionalism than I had any right to expect. Peterson looked surprised. You didn't request a formal investigation, Colonel. Sarah shook her head. Admiral Thornfield made a serious error in judgment, but I believe that education and understanding are more effective than punishment in changing attitudes and behaviors. The two admirals exchanged glances, clearly impressed by Sarah's response, but also aware of the larger implications of the morning's events. That's very generous, Colonel, Peterson said. But this incident has implications beyond just the two of you. There were dozens of witnesses, and word has already spread throughout the command. The Navy has to respond appropriately. Thornfield nodded, understanding that his fate was no longer entirely in his own hands, or even in Sarah's. Understand. I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions. Admiral Thornfield, Sarah said. May I make a suggestion? Both admirals looked at her with interest. Instead of treating this as purely a disciplinary matter, what if we used it as an opportunity for positive change? Admiral Thornfield could work with diversity and inclusion programs, sharing his experience and helping to educate other officers who might hold similar prejudices. Peterson considered the proposal carefully. That's an interesting idea, but it would have to come from Washington, and it would require Admiral Thornfield to be completely honest about his attitudes and the process of changing them. I'm willing to do that, Thornfield said immediately. If my mistakes can help prevent other officers from making the same errors, then maybe some good can come from this disaster. Sarah stood up, gathering her materials. Gentlemen, I have another presentation to give this afternoon, and I need some time to prepare. Admiral Thornfield, I hope you'll consider what we've discussed. Change is possible, but only if you're willing to do the difficult work of examining your own beliefs and assumptions. As she prepared to leave, Thornfield stood as well. Colonel Martinez, I want you to know that your presentation today was one of the most powerful and important things I've ever heard. It's changed my perspective on our military and on leadership in ways that I'm still processing. Sarah paused at the door. Admiral, your daughter probably faces challenges and prejudices every day in her service, but she also has opportunities to show other officers, through her performance and professionalism that their preconceptions are wrong. That's the burden and the privilege that comes with breaking barriers. After Sarah left, the two admirals sat in silence for several minutes, processing the morning's events and their implications. Marcus, Peterson said finally, "You've got a long road ahead of you. But if you handle this correctly, if you're genuinely willing to learn and change, you might be able to salvage not just your career, but your reputation." Thornfield nodded, understanding that his future now depended entirely on his ability to demonstrate genuine transformation rather than mere regret. "Jim, I keep thinking about Emily, about all the capable officers I might have dismissed over the years because of my prejudices. Colonel Martinez was right. This isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of thinking that's probably damaged our military in ways I never considered." Peterson stood up to leave. "Then, use that realization to fuel the work ahead of you. The Navy needs leaders who can learn from their mistakes and help others do the same. This could be the most important mission of your career." As Admiral Peterson departed to assume his new command responsibilities, Admiral Thornfield remained alone in the conference room, staring at the empty podium where Sarah had delivered her transformative presentation. For the first time in his 30-year career, he found himself questioning not just his assumptions about individual officers, but his fundamental understanding of what made the military strong. The man who had entered the naval base that morning as a confident, arrogant flag officer was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the difference between true strength and mere prejudice. The road ahead would be difficult and uncertain, but for the first time since the morning's confrontation, Admiral Thornfield felt something that resembled hope. 6 months later, Colonel Sarah Martinez stood in the Pentagon briefing room, facing a gathering of the most senior military leaders in the United States. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished conference table where generals and admirals from all branches of service had assembled for a quarterly review of joint operations effectiveness. The events at the naval base had created ripple effects that extended far beyond a single confrontation between two officers. Sarah's presentation had been distributed throughout the military command structure, sparking conversations and policy reviews that were still ongoing. More importantly, it had catalyzed a broader examination of military culture and the barriers that prevented the full utilization of available talent. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Washington began, "6 months ago, we witnessed an incident that highlighted some uncomfortable truths about our military culture. Today, we're here to review the progress we've made in addressing those issues." Sarah took her place at the presentation podium, but the atmosphere was markedly different from that tense morning at the naval base. The officers in this room were here voluntarily, eager to learn about initiatives that were already showing promising results. "The diversity and inclusion review we launched has produced some remarkable findings," Sarah began, activating the projection system. "Units that have undergone bias awareness training and implemented merit-based evaluation protocols have shown measurable improvements in both performance and retention rates." The statistics displayed on the screen were impressive. Training programs that focused on recognizing and overcoming unconscious bias have been implemented across all branches of service, with participation from officers at every level of command. "Perhaps most significantly," Sarah continued, "we've seen a 30% increase in retention rates among officers from underrepresented groups and a corresponding improvement in mission success rates for joint operations." Admiral Peterson, who had permanently assumed command of naval special warfare after Admiral Thornfield's reassignment, nodded approvingly from his seat. "Colonel, can you tell us about the mentorship programs that have been established?" "Certainly, Admiral," Sarah replied, clicking to the next slide. "We've created cross-branch mentorship programs that pair senior officers with junior officers from different demographic backgrounds. The goal isn't just to provide career guidance, but to break down barriers and challenge assumptions on both sides." The mentorship program had been one of the most successful initiatives to emerge from the post-incident review. Senior officers who participated reported that they gained valuable perspectives from their ments, while junior officers benefited from the guidance and advocacy of established leaders. "One of our most effective mentors," Sarah said, "is someone who initially resisted the entire concept of diversity and inclusion initiatives." The door to the briefing room opened, and Admiral Marcus Thornfield entered quietly, taking a seat in the back row. His presence caused a slight stir among the assembled officers, many of whom remembered the circumstances that had led to his current assignment. Thornfield looked different from the man who had confronted Sarah 6 months earlier. His bearing was still military correct, but there was a humility in his expression that hadn't been there before. His uniform now bore the insignia of his new position as Director of Leadership Development and Inclusion, a role he had requested after completing his formal review in Washington. Admiral Thornfield, General Washington said, addressing him directly, "Would you be willing to share your perspective on the mentorship program?" Thornfield stood and moved to the front of the room, his movements deliberate but not arrogant. The transformation was remarkable to those who had witnessed his previous behavior. "General, 6 months ago, I was the poster child for everything wrong with military leadership culture," Thornfield began, his voice steady but humble. "My prejudices had made me not just a poor leader, but a danger to the very institution I had sworn to serve." The room was completely silent. Every officer focused on Thornfield's words. This was not the kind of public admission that senior military officers typically made, and his honesty was both uncomfortable and compelling. "The mentorship program forced me to confront the reality that I had been dismissing and undermining qualified officers for my entire career," Thornfield continued. "Not intentionally, but because I had never questioned my own assumptions about what effective leadership looked like." He gestured towards Sarah, who was watching him with an expression of professional interest rather than personal animosity. "Colonel Martinez didn't just expose my prejudices that morning at the naval base. She demonstrated a form of leadership that I had never fully understood or appreciated. Her willingness to focus on mission success rather than personal vindication, her commitment to building bridges rather than walls, her insistence on judging people by their performance rather than their demographics. These weren't signs of weakness, as I had always assumed. They were signs of strength." Admiral Peterson leaned forward in his chair. "Marcus, can you be more specific about what you've learned for the mentorship program?" Thornfield nodded. "I've been mentoring a young Army captain named Jessica Chun, a logistics officer with exceptional analytical skills and innovative thinking. 6 months ago, I would have dismissed her as a support officer with no real understanding of combat operations." He paused, clearly still processing his own transformation. "Captain Chun has developed supply chain innovations that have improved operational efficiency for Special Operations Forces by more than 20%. Her insights have directly contributed to mission success in ways that my traditional combat experience never could have." General Hayes spoke up from the front row. "And how has this changed your approach to leadership?" "It's taught me that strength comes from inclusion rather than exclusion," Thornfield replied. "The most effective teams aren't composed of people who all think the same way and share the same background. They're composed of people who bring different perspectives, different skills, and different approaches to problem solving." Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by Thornfield's evolution. The man standing before them bore little resemblance to the arrogant admiral who had tried to humiliate her months earlier. This transformation appeared to be genuine rather than merely strategic. "Admiral Thornfield," Sarah said, "you mentioned that this process has been personally difficult. Can you elaborate on that?" Thornfield's expression grew more serious. "Colonel, confronting your own prejudices is one of the most painful experiences a person can go through. It requires admitting that you've been wrong about fundamental issues, that you've potentially harmed people you were supposed to lead and protect." He looked around the room at the assembled officers. "I had to contact every officer I could remember treating unfairly over the years. Some wouldn't speak to me. Others accepted my apologies, but made it clear that words weren't enough. A few, like my own daughter, told me that they had been waiting their entire careers for someone like me to finally understand what they had been experiencing." The mention of his daughter brought a visible emotion to Thornfield's face. Captain Emily Thornfield had been one of the most difficult conversations he had faced during his transformation process. "My daughter told me something that I'll never forget," Thornfield continued. "She said that officers like me had forced her to be twice as good as her male colleagues, just to be considered half as qualified. She said that she had always loved and respected me, but that she had also been ashamed of the attitudes I represented." The room remained silent as Thornfield processed this admission. Several officers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing aspects of their own behavior in his description. General Washington stood up, commanding attention from the entire room. "Admiral Thornfield's transformation demonstrates something important about our military culture. Change is possible, but only when we're willing to acknowledge our failures and commit to doing better." He gestured toward both Sarah and Thornfield. 6 months ago, these two officers represented a fundamental divide in our military. Today, they represent the possibility of bridging that divide through honest dialogue, mutual respect, and a shared commitment to mission success. Sarah stepped forward to address this point directly. General Washington is correct, but I want to emphasize that this transformation couldn't have happened without Admiral Thornfield's willingness to do the difficult work of self-examination. Change requires both courage and humility. She looked at Thornfield with an expression of professional respect. Admiral Thornfield has demonstrated both qualities over the past 6 months. His work with the mentorship program has been exceptional, and his willingness to share his experience publicly has helped other officers confront their own biases. Thornfield nodded gratefully. Colonel Martinez, I want to publicly acknowledge something that I should have said 6 months ago. You are one of the finest officers it has been my privilege to work with. Your skills, your leadership, and your character have earned my complete respect and admiration. The room erupted in spontaneous applause, recognizing the significance of this moment. The Admiral who had once questioned Sarah's qualifications was now her strongest advocate, and his transformation had become a model for other officers struggling with similar issues. General Torres stood to address the broader implications of what they had witnessed. This transformation demonstrates why our diversity and inclusion initiatives are not about political correctness or social engineering. They're about military effectiveness and national security. He activated his own presentation slide, showing data from recent operations. Units that have embraced inclusive leadership principles are outperforming traditional units across every metric we measure. Mission success rates, casualty reduction, innovation in tactics and procedures, retention of high-performing personnel. The evidence is overwhelming. Admiral Peterson added his own perspective. The naval special warfare community has undergone significant cultural changes over the past 6 months. Our recruiting has expanded to reach qualified candidates who might have been overlooked in the past, and our training programs now emphasize the leadership principles that Colonel Martinez demonstrated. Sarah looked around the room at the assembled officers, seeing engagement and understanding rather than the defensive resistance that had characterized many previous discussions of these issues. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, the military's strength has always come from our ability to adapt and evolve. We've changed our tactics, our technology, and our organizational structures to meet new challenges. Now we're changing our culture to ensure that we can harness the full range of talent and capability available to us. As the briefing concluded, officers began filing out of the room, many stopping to thank Sarah for her presentation or to continue conversations with colleagues about implementing similar programs in their own units. Admiral Thornfield approached Sarah as she gathered her materials. Colonel, I wanted to ask if you would consider co-presenting with me at the Joint Chiefs Annual Leadership Conference next month. Sarah looked up, surprised by the request. What would be the topic, Admiral? Transformational leadership and cultural change, Thornfield replied. I think our story, the incident that brought us together, and the work we've done since then could help other officers understand both the challenges and the opportunities we face. Sarah considered the proposal carefully. 6 months earlier, the idea of working with Admiral Thornfield would have been unthinkable. Now, it seemed like a natural evolution of the journey they had both traveled. I think that would be valuable, Admiral, she replied. But only if we can be completely honest about the difficulties involved. Change isn't easy, and it requires sustained effort and commitment. Absolutely, Thornfield agreed. The goal wouldn't be to pretend that transformation is simple or painless. It would be to demonstrate that it's possible and worthwhile. As they walked out of the Pentagon briefing room together, Sarah reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun as a humiliating confrontation had evolved into a partnership that was helping to transform military culture throughout all branches of service. The road ahead remained challenging. Cultural change in an institution as large and traditional as the military would take years to complete. There would be setbacks, resistance, and moments of doubt. But as Sarah looked at Admiral Thornfield walking beside her, she felt genuinely optimistic about the future. If someone as entrenched in traditional attitudes as he had been could undergo such a complete transformation, then change was possible for anyone willing to do the work. Their story had become more than just a personal journey. It had become a symbol of the military's capacity for growth, adaptation, and positive change. And in a world where the challenges facing the United States require the best efforts of all qualified personnel, that capacity for change might be the difference between success and failure. The colonel and the admiral walked through the Pentagon corridor side by side, no longer adversaries, but partners in the ongoing mission to build a stronger, more inclusive, and more effective military. Their transformation was complete, but their work was just beginning.